So no glass to tap here.
Your whistle, Roger. Your infamous whistle.
Yeah, right.
Into the mic. That'll get everybody's attention.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for coming out this evening. We hope we will make it very much worth your while. I'm Roger Blood, Chair of the Housing Advisory Board. We have a panel for the second half of third of this evening, which we'll introduce individually when the panel portion begins. We'd like to welcome you for a joint session of the sponsored by the Housing Advisory Board and the Economic Development Advisory Board, HAB and EDAB. And we hope that, among other things, we'll be able to demonstrate tonight that expanding the tax base to help Brookline schools and other needs, fiscal needs, is not in any way contradictory to growing our affordable housing supply in Brookline. Two very important goals, and we're going to try our best to make them work together, and in some ways that you'll see tonight. We're delighted to have a very terrific guest speaker for you to kick things off. Barry Bluestone is here to give you a presentation which will set the stage for what is to follow later in the evening. And by setting the stage, you're going to see a little bit more than Brookline in terms of affordable housing and how it fits in the larger picture of development and housing. So I just will take a moment and introduce Professor Bluestone, and we'll see his show and tell. Barry Bluestone is a professor of political economy in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. At Northeastern, Dr. Bluestone was founding director of the Dukakis Center, very familiar name to us here, for urban and regional policy, and he was also the founding dean of Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Previously, Dr. Bluestone was the founding director of UMass Boston's PhD program in public policy, and before going to UMass in '86, he taught economics at Boston College for 15 years. And I understand you know our colleague and vice chair of our Board of Assessors, Professor Harold Peterson, from earlier in your career. Professor Bluestone received his BA, MA, and PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. At the Dukakis Center, Dr. Bluestone has led research projects on housing, local economic development, and state and local public finance. A bullseye for what we're going to be talking about tonight, I think. And under Dr. Bluestone's direction, the Dukakis Center, since 2002, has published the annual housing report cards, which have probed Greater Boston's housing landscape, keeping tabs on housing construction, home prices, and rents. These report cards have analyzed the region's economy, demography, and housing, and have kept track of government policies that affect the region's housing market, including ours here in Brookline. So we're delighted to have you, Dr. Bluestone, and he will be sharing highlights of the very recently published housing report card. And then our panel discussion to follow. As I mentioned, we will be exploring collectively with you how some of your findings and thoughts might be applied constructively here in Brookline. Welcome.
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to go through a lot of slides very quickly because I'm really excited about the panel. But I thought we'd set the stage with some of the data that came out of the 2017 Greater Boston Housing Report Card, plus I put together a little data here on Brookline. You're going to have to, therefore, spend about the next 15 or 20 minutes with me. My late wife, my darling late wife, once introduced me, not here, but in the town of Newton, before a group like this, and finally said to them, I want you to be, kind to my husband. He's an economist by training. He has neither the personality nor charm to be an accountant. So let's take a look. As you all know, the economy of the Commonwealth is doing very well. If you look at statewide, we actually have created over 355,000 jobs since 2009. We've added 11% to our workforce. Not surprising, a lot of that shows up when you're trying to commute around Greater Boston. To a great extent, the congestion we have on our highways is due to our economic strength. Real wages have started to rise, although only rising slowly. They're still less than 10% higher than they were a decade ago, but we're starting to see some improvement in wages. Greater Boston, of course, and we take Greater Boston to be the 5 counties of Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk counties, are where the bulk of these jobs have grown. 284,000, or more than 83% of the jobs throughout the state, are just in the 5 counties that make up Greater Boston. But that has now given us a challenge, obviously a challenge of transportation, but it's also a challenge in terms of how do we find enough housing for people who need to work here. How do we make sure that housing is affordable to all the different kinds of workers we have, particularly because if the supply of housing does not catch up with demand, simple economics will tell you that prices will continue to rise. And of course, that is exactly what's been happening in Greater Boston, and particularly happening in places like Brookline and Newton, Wellesley, and other communities that are delightful places to live, as you well know. But then you ask the question, what happens to the people who are priced out of it? I recently spent some time with my dear friend, Congressman Kennedy. And as you may know, Joe and his wife and their 2 children have just left Brookline for Newton. And I said, why? He says, I can't afford Brookline. Now, when a Kennedy can't afford Brookline, we've got an issue. So the real question is, how do we deal with all of this? Well, here's what's happened. If we look throughout the Greater Boston 5-county area, prices just since 2009, 9 years, 8 years actually when we do the study, are up 32%, up $109,000. Let me give you a comparison of how wild this is. I actually grew up in Detroit, Michigan, born Brooklyn, New York. But my sister Karen, who was a longtime Brookline resident with her husband Bruce Cohn, and my 2 sisters, I grew up in Detroit, and I just went back for my 55th high school reunion. And you know Detroit's on hard times, and I said, I want to go see the home where I grew up. And so I drove over, and I'm standing outside with a couple of my classmates, all of whom are 73 years old now, and the owner of our house, my former house, comes out and kind of, why are you staring at my house? I said, well, I used to live here. He says, oh, wonderful, come on in. He is a African-American engineer at Ford, wife, 2 young kids. He's moved from the suburbs back into Detroit because he's one of those urban pioneers who wants to rebuild the city. Now, we lived in a shack in Detroit. My father worked for the Auto Worker Union. We didn't get paid that well, so we lived in a shack. It was about 3,000 square feet, brick, slate roof, had a lovely little cherry wood library to the left that you got through leaded glass doors. To the right was a small living room about the size of, well, maybe this room with a marble fireplace. And if you walk down the end of the corridor, there was a formal dining room with a leaded glass door and a modest-sized kitchen and dinette, a full-furnished basement, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a 2-car garage, a beautiful backyard, and a screened-in porch. So I asked him, how long have you lived here? He said, well, I've lived here for 2 years. We bought it 2 years ago. I said, well, could you tell me what you paid for it? And he said, oh, yeah, you got to see it's in perfect condition, so we had to pay absolute top dollar, $38,000. Okay? That's what happens when you have a 30% vacancy rate, and the city has gone from 1.9 million to 600,000. Detroit is now has 143 square miles, 3 or 4 times the size of Boston geographically, but a population which is actually now smaller than the city of Boston. If you look at Brookline, I went back and I looked at Brookline and I compared Brookline to Greater Boston. The median single home price in Brookline is 2.7 times the median price in all of Greater Boston in 2005. It was 3.7 times by 2015. The median price now is 4 times what it is in the rest of Greater Boston. Right? appreciation has been highest, I've done what is called a price gradient, which is how do prices go on average as you get further away from the inner core. Think of downtown Boston moving up. And you'll see if you're within 5 miles of the inner core, that's the top left bar, the average price about $775,000, and you'll see it go down. So once you're out about 40 miles from here, it's down to about $366,000. But what's interesting is that more recently, that gradient has been flattening. That's the gray bars. And the reason for that is working families are being so priced out of Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, where I live, that they're moving further and further away to try and find a place that they can afford. In fact, what is amazing is last year, the price appreciation, percentage change in price of a single-family home in Lawrence was more than the price appreciation in Newton and Brookline. And the reason is people have to move further and further away, and of course that's what's also giving our transportation network this problem. For condos still tend to be right downtown, right in the inner city, and there's been very little flattening. But because we've had a lot of production, particularly in Boston, with the 53,000 units of housing that Mayor Walsh has promised, and they're on schedule or ahead of schedule of making that, we've had an enormous amount of condo construction, particularly at the high end. But it has started to moderate prices just a little bit in the last 2 years. What about rents? Well, because we've had a lot of housing construction, particularly in Boston, rental vacancy rates have risen a little bit over the last 3 years. And as rental vacancy rates go up, prices tend to stabilize a little bit because you don't have such a seller's market. Now the buyers can compete, one landlord against another. That shows up with a slight decline in the average rent. This is across all size rental properties, down from a peak of $2,952 for the average market rent in inner core Boston, which is Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge in this case, to $2,874. But that still means that if you just rented the average apartment in the inner core, the average costs you nearly $36,000. Average household income in the inner core is $55,000. So you can see how that doesn't really work. And what that means is that we have very high rents. You'll see that the current average market rent in Brookline is about $2,785, and it ranges from a little under $2,000 for a studio to more than $4,500 for a 3-bedroom apartment. So take $4,500, multiply that by 12, and you're talking about a rent of in excess of $50,000 a year just to rent an apartment. The other thing that's been happening is it's the rental market that's really been hit hardest. If you go back to 2000 to 2004, you would have seen that single-family homes, that's the light gray bar, rose by about 48%. That's rents rose by that much. Single-family home prices. Condo prices rose by 63%. Rents hardly rose at all, 6.2%. We had enough rental housing to keep rents from rising. Between 2004 and 2009, during the housing crisis and the meltdown, single-family home prices dropped about 9%. Condo prices dropped a little bit, 3%. Rents started to rise faster. And then if you look at since 2009, it's really rents that are rising much faster than home prices or condo prices. And to the extent that you have young people who can't yet get into the housing market, either because of low incomes or because they've got tons of college debt, that rental market is a disaster. My 26-year-old son went to high school in Cambridge. He departed to Northwestern University for his college degree, stayed in Chicago to teach school, and has just taken a job at the Match Charter School in Hyde Park. He called me and said, "Dad, I'm coming home." I said, "Fine, I'll help you find an apartment." And he said, "Dad, what's wrong with our house?" So I now have a roommate. And after a week with me, he came up to me and says, "Dad, I'm going to assume that you've not had a real roommate in maybe 60 years. And you've probably forgotten the rules." And as I told you, I'm a widower. And he gave me all the rules. This is your space. This is my space. And, we'll work all that out. But he says, Dad, if I happen to bring a young lady over, I expect you to be real scarce. And I looked at him and I said, Josh, if I bring an old lady over, I expect you to be real scarce. We've been working it out real well. But he did the math, and he couldn't afford an apartment, and I'm giving him free rent, right, through September. What's happened to the median renter is median renter household income between 2000 and basically 2013 increased about 13%. That is controlling, for inflation. Median effective rent has gone up 21%, and the asking rent, if there are no discounts, has gone up by 27%. As a result, those households are now considered rent burdened, paying more than 30% of their gross income on rent, have gone from 39% in 2000 to more than half today, all through Greater Boston. Those who are severely cost burdened, spending more than half their gross income on rent, now are 1 in 4 households throughout Greater Boston. And 35% of all homeowners who have a mortgage are paying more than 30% of their income to cover property, their mortgage interest and taxes. So what's happening to rents in older homes? This is where we'll come back. So this is a street not far from where I live in Cambridge. Those are triple deckers. And those are the people who lived there in 1910. They were Irish and Italian immigrants, many people from Eastern Europe. And this housing stock was built specifically for them because it could be built inexpensively, and an immigrant family could come here and over 4 or 5 years get a grub stake and buy one of these and rent 2 of the units out, either to family members or to somebody else from the old village or the shtetl. And this worked well. These are exactly the same units today, and there are the people who live there. Young kids. They're my graduate students at Northeastern. They're interns and residents at all the teaching hospitals. There are many of the young millennials who are now taking jobs in Kendall Square and the South Boston Seaport. They're able to get 2 or 3 or 4 of them, like my son will do probably in September, and rent out one of these units for $4,500 a month. And working families are just being pushed out. When I first moved in to our house, my wife owned it before me on Trowbridge Street in Cambridge, I noticed at Christmas almost every house was decorated up and down the street. There's only one left across the street, an Italian family that's been there for 3 generations. Everybody else there are young professionals or graduate students. Working families have been pushed out. That's the problem I've had to deal with. If you really want to get rich, don't invest in the stock market. Buy up triple deckers. Triple deckers appreciation is faster than anything I've ever seen. Just since 2009, if you wanted to buy a single unit in a triple decker, the price has risen 127%. It's a great deal because you'll find young people who are flocking to Greater Boston, renting these out at exorbitant rents. So part of what I'm going to say in closing here is we need to think about the new demography of Greater Boston, the new demography of Cambridge, of Somerville, of Boston, but also Brookline, Newton, and so forth. And what we're going to find out is that one part of that is we're attracting enormous numbers of young people. Good news is we've started to increase the amount of housing stock. We're getting more permits, but it turns out this is almost exclusively in Boston. Mayor Walsh has done a great job. If you just look between 2016 and 2017, we increased the total number of permits issued, but that was only because Boston increased their permitting by a great amount, and the other 146 towns and cities in Greater Boston actually issued fewer permits in 2017 than they did in 2016. And so Boston, one town with 600,000 people out of 3.1 million, one city out of 147 communities, now issued 41% of all the housing permits. That's up from 29% just the year before. If you look at new housing permits in Brookline, and this is from the U.S. Census, in 2015, Brookline permitted 80 units, 2016, 16 units, 2017, 10 units. at least reported by the census. This is happening in community after community. Right. Good news is where we're getting those permits, particularly in Boston and a few other places, they're more and more the multifamily units we're going to need, because as you're about ready to see, the demographic projections really tell us something new about the demography. As I said, Metro Boston's population has increased by about 328,000, but who's growing the population? If you just look at Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville, in the year 2000, according to the census, 20 to 34-year-olds, the so-called millennials, made up about a third of the population. Between 2000 and 2010, they made up three-quarters of the growth in the population. So keep your mind on that demographic and compare it with the immigrant families who came here as young families with children between 1870 and 1920, when Boston alone's population went from 250,000 to 750,000, an increase of 500,000 in 50 years, and we housed them all because of triple-deckers. But if you go even further, you'll realize that the population is bimodal, we'd say. The growth in the population between now and 2030, according to the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, will be made up of those younger people who are aging and people like me and some of you in the room. That is the new demographics of Greater Boston, as opposed to the demographics after World War II, when the typical family was headed by somebody between the ages of 20 and 44. So this is going to require a whole new kind of housing. We're going to have the need for a lot of housing for single people like myself, young couples and older couples, perhaps retired, and we're going to need very little housing for that is the large single-family home that many of us grew up in. That is the new demography, at least through 2030. It's even more extreme through 2040 as we live longer, right? So we need housing for three kinds of folks. The millennials who are flooding this area, working families who are being priced out and moving further and further away in order to find a place to live, and me, aging baby boomers who are now ready to downsize. So in closing, I'd like to talk about an idea I started floating a few years ago. It was the idea of a graduate student village. We have something like 100,000 graduate students all through Greater Boston, and I think about 60,000 or so just in the inner core. 92% of them live off campus. They're living on my street. We have something like 12,000 interns and residents. I was just with the Partners CEO, and he was telling us about this. And that's one group. And I said, well, why don't we build housing for them that would have all the right amenities so they'd want to move there rather than live in the triple-deckers and the duplexes, and free up the older housing for those working families whose parents or grandparents once lived there. And so I came up with this idea of providing new opportunities to free up this housing, and I called it the Graduate Student Village. And then in a talk like this last year, somebody got up and said, but what about you, Barry? And I said, oh my God, I want the same kind of housing. I'd like it to be a place that has a lot of amenities. I don't want to take care of a lawn. I don't want to take care of shoveling the snow. I would love to retire with a lot of people like me, but also others. I kind of like that idea. And so the idea is to create not apartments, but villages. Bring back the idea of a village, but a vertical one. 5 stories, 6 stories, in some areas it could be higher, like in Malden Center. I've been talking with the mayor there. And I call them a village because the idea would be to bring together people of diverse backgrounds, of diverse incomes. My graduate students, I have graduate students who are starving graduate students. One of my students is from Saudi Arabia. He drives a Mercedes. Okay? He could afford a very nice unit in my village. It could be one of the penthouse units with the larger, kitchen, larger living room, granite countertops, rather than Formica. Or his parents, he's a prince, his father's a prince in Saudi Arabia, would just buy the building for cash, or maybe most of the zip code. So we're talking about not just little micro units that we pile on top of each other, although some of them would be like that, but a range of units at different price ranges with different finishes. Maybe the first floor would have some retail like a Trader Joe's and a gym. A nice kind of deck on the roof for barbecues and your friends. I love the idea because I do a lot of theater work, having a black box theater in the basement where you put on poetry and music and stuff like that. But make it so nice that most young people and people like me would rather live there than with 4 roommates on the second floor of a triple-decker. Okay? Lots of common shared space, which makes it a village. I love the idea, as you'll see, of getting universities to do this together. So we have engineers from Northeastern living with violinists from the conservatories, living with law students at Harvard. Kind of cool, right? And a few old people like me, right? Retail establishes near public transit as much as possible. And then we'd have some zip cars in the basement rather than a lot of parking. So if you have that hot date, you're 23, you're going out, you take the Mini Cooper. If you're going to IKEA, you rent the van. I mean, we could do that, right? Storage lockers in the basement. This is what some of it could look like. Kind of nice. And finally, how do we get it done? The idea is let's bring together a new collaboration. This would be produced by private developers in the private market, but it could be both for-profit and non-profit developers like CDCs. We would want to be able to find a way so that the rental rates would remain reasonable with some kind of deed restrictions. We could get some of the quasi-public agencies like Mass Development, Mass Housing Partnership, and MHIC, Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, perhaps to float some tax-exempt bonds for this kind of thing. Most importantly, we'd want to get the universities and the teaching hospitals involved and have them not only market this to their students, but let's say we got 5 universities together and they worked with one developer and each university took a master lease on, let's say, 60 units, guaranteeing occupancy for 15 years. It guarantees the funding. We could do that at almost zero risk to the university because they'd only be responsible for a small number of them. And if they couldn't rent them to their own graduate students, they could put them on the open market. I'll rent it, right? We've been working with a whole bunch of developers, including Wynn and Corcoran Jennison. We've been working with construction firms like Suffolk and Gilbane to think about what these units might look like and also the possibility of building a manufacturing facility somewhere in Greater Boston that would produce panelized construction or parts of these units. We were thinking about working with Madison Park, a failing vocational school in Boston, to teach young people the skills. And this could become actually a major export industry. We would not only produce housing units for us, we could export them. Right now, some of these developers are using panelized construction. They're coming from Canada and Pennsylvania. Why not us? If we can do biotech, we should be able to do housing and reduce the cost. I've been working with the building trades. The former president of the Carpenters Union and I have designed this together. We're talking about how we could get unionized tradesmen to take a lower pay with good benefits, but with 12-month work in these manufacturing facilities to improve productivity. And we're talking about municipal government, like Brookline, others, making some zoning changes around parking, around density, and so forth to allow this, and so forth. We could do that. In some cases, there's surplus municipal land. We've been talking with the mayor of Malden about being able to build something there right next to the Orange Line. We can get the state government, of course, as I said, to do some bonding authority, maybe create a state tax credit for such housing, and also use some of the state-owned surplus land and MBTA surplus land for this. Finally, how would we do it? 10-step program. Steps 1 through 3, form a new housing task force to research all these ideas. I've just started with my capstone master's students, a survey of graduate students at Northeastern, Boston University, and we hope Boston College and UMass, about what kind of housing options they'd like. We want the governor, and I've talked with Governor Baker about this, to work with some of the local mayors and convene developers and architects and architectural firms and the trades to really talk about how we get this done. And then we would also, in the next step, work with the unions to talk about that manufacturing facility, and also then bring together university presidents, the CEOs of the major teaching hospitals, and perhaps some of the other CEOs of large firms to say, okay, we need you to help. help us build this housing, not just for graduate students, but for your own, some of your employees and folks like Barry. And then talk about where we might be able to site this in areas that the community would be happy to have this kind of housing and to do it consistent with the environment around the housing, and then do some new zoning provisions to make this possible, sign those agreements between the developers, the universities, and the teaching hospitals, and then build it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barry. That was very, very enlightening. A great start for the discussion that will follow. We are going to segue into our panel discussion with a brief presentation and remarks from Virginia Bullock, who heads the Housing Division in the Planning Department. We work very closely with Virginia on the affordable housing. The governor has launched something called Housing Choice Initiative, a piece of legislation that Virginia is going to give you some brief highlights about that may become very important to Brookline. Virginia?
Hi, I'm Virginia Bullock. I'm the Senior Housing Planner for the town of Brookline. And I just wanted to share some information regarding the recently announced Governor's Housing Choice Initiative, because, as Roger said, I think that it might be something that we might be examining and potentially working on here in Brookline. Basically, the Housing Choice Initiative was announced in December by the governor in response to the fact that, the Commonwealth, and particularly Eastern Massachusetts and Greater Boston, has the fifth most expensive housing market in the country at this point. And the goal of this initiative is to create 135,000 new units of housing statewide by 2025. As Barry mentioned, supply is not keeping up with demand, but there are towns and cities that are actually taking this on head-on, like the city of Boston, with a commitment of 53,000 new units of housing by 2030, but the city of Boston cannot take on the burden of the need for housing. So the initiative is designed to try to encourage municipalities to partner with the state and to address the challenges by both adopting best practices and also making changes to the local zoning laws that might remove barriers or encourage housing production. The two specific approaches of the initiative include, one, allowing municipalities to apply for housing choice designation, which rewards communities that are producing new housing and have adopted best practices with access to capital grant program as well as existing state grants. I did put a summary of this info out on the table if folks can pick it up. There's also a website. Unfortunately, Brookline does not qualify because we have not produced enough housing to qualify for this designation. You have to have produced at least 300 new units of housing in the last 5 years, and we have not. We've produced potentially around 100 new units of housing in the last 5 years. The other piece of the initiative is that the governor is proposing legislation that would, statewide legislation that would allow towns and cities to adopt certain zoning changes that would eliminate barriers to housing production with a simple majority at town meeting versus a supermajority. So if the legislation passed of 2/3, so if the legislation passed at the state level, it would allow Brookline to take the option of changing its zoning to include things such as accessory dwelling units, increased density through special permit process, reducing parking requirements, dimensional requirements such as minimum lot sizes, height setbacks in certain districts, allowing for mixed-use zoning or multifamily housing in other districts, adopting smart growth 40R districts in transit areas, or allowing for transfer of development rights. Those are just some examples. The intent of the legislation is to encourage towns and cities to reduce zoning barriers to increasing the supply of housing, both all kinds of housing, mixed income housing, which the panel will talk about. And we should certainly continue, and I believe the Housing Advisory Board will continue to monitor this initiative and advise town leaders on the best way for Brookline to participate in this initiative. The last thing I want to mention is that in addition to the Housing Choice Initiative, that Brookline is also participating, and many of you have seen this in the paper, with the Metropolitan Mayors Coalition Regional Housing Priorities Task Force, along with 13 other communities in the greater Boston area: Newton, Somerville, Cambridge, Quincy, Chelsea, several others. The task force is going to be working over the next 6 to 8 months with Mass Area Planning Council to establish regional housing production goals based on a detailed analysis of existing housing and projected needs. And it's anticipated that within the next 6 to 8 months, there will be actual regional goals set for each community in those to try to see if we can meet some of the targets that Barry described in his presentation. So that's basically the overall. If people have questions, they can talk after. There's information on the table. The last thing I want to say is that the panel is going to ask some questions, but if folks have questions that they would like to have asked of the panel or Barry, I'm going to pass these index cards around. If you can write your questions, and then perhaps we can get
Okay, thank you, Virginia. Well, we're going to move into our panel discussion. Andy, can you give us the one graphic up there? For those of you that are maybe less comfortable seating in the back, if you'd like to join us a little closer, there's a good dozen empty seats in the front, few rows up here, so feel free at this transition of the program to come forward if you wish to be more comfortable. Some of you may remember that the town went through a public process about a year long that culminated in something called a housing production plan for Brookline. We had a number of public meetings and then had a written plan. It's posted on the town's website. It was used at the time for potentially receiving some temporary relief from too much so-called 40B development in town. But the report actually had quite a few interesting concepts and thoughts about where Brookline could advance its affordable housing development positively in areas where it didn't intrude in a negative way to existing residential neighborhoods. And what you see on the screen is one of the visuals that was in that report, which identified in Brookline what were called opportunity corridors, and they are in the sort of greenish, you can see the corridors on the map, and then opportunity nodes secondarily that are in yellow. As we have our panel discussion tonight, we're going to keep this slide up, and you may want to bear some of this in mind, that the opportunity corridors are where economic development through expansion of our commercial tax base has the greatest opportunity to combine with housing and affordable housing development in so-called mixed use, mixed income housing projects and housing development in these opportunity corridors, and that would be consistent with what we've sent to the state and hopefully something that would be viewed favorably by the Brookline community at large. So at this point, let me just introduce the several panelists that you have to participate in this discussion. On my right, on your left, is Paul Sainer. Paul is the co-chair of the Economic Development Advisory Board. He's a town meeting member from Precinct 13, was appointed in 2013 by Governor Patrick as Commissioner of the Mass Commission for the Blind, and he still has that position at present. And prior to that appointment, Paul previously held several Boston-based executive positions in real estate development, consulting, and banking. To my far left, Mike Jacobs, longtime member of the Housing Advisory Board, and Mike is also the vice chair, again longtime, vice chair of the board of the Brookline Housing Authority. And the way our Housing Advisory Board is structured, Mike is the designated representative or seat from the Brookline Housing Authority on the Housing Advisory Board. Mike is the principal of Brookline-based MHJ Associates, which does consulting on affordable housing funding and development. Very knowledgeable guy in this area, and a guy I rely on a lot in the work of the HAB, for sure. And next to Mike, Ann Myers is the co-chair of the Economic Development Advisory Board, works very closely with Paul. And Ann served for 10 years as the Deputy Director of Real Estate for Massport, and 8 years as the President of the Downtown Crossing Association, now known as Brookline Improvement District? Business Improvement District, Brookline Improvement, of course, downtown Boston. And you already know Barry Bluestone, and so we are your panel for the evening, and I'm going to ask Paul if you might kick off the questioning.
Thank you very much, Roger. Barry, I'd like to follow up on your housing report card's recommendations around 21st century villages, which, as I understand it, are essentially mixed-use developments. And let's talk in the context of targeting millennials and seniors, which are very significant demographics here in Brookline. To put a little context around the applicability of that to Brookline, I want to provide a couple of, but certainly not a complete list of constraints relating to development. First of all, as we see from the housing production plan and the opportunity corridors, there are a number of commercial areas in this town that are underdeveloped in relation to surrounding residential neighborhoods, and that's particularly true along Beacon Street. Certainly residential values, market rate residential values, as your report card underscored, are extraordinarily strong in this community. These sites, however, are very tight. They're often cheek and jowl with residential neighborhoods. They're very expensive to develop because they're tight, and perhaps even more expensive to develop than in Boston, because town meeting isn't as progressive around parking as the city seems to be. The modular units that you referenced raise questions around how contextual that would fit into the design of our urban neighborhoods. We very much value high-quality urban design. There's no opportunities in Brookline for significant commercial linkage. We just don't have that level of commercial property interest. Certainly, anything that would require redevelopment would likely, especially at the magnitude that you mentioned, require upzoning by town meeting, which is a very high standard. Pointing out the obvious, unlike most of our metropolitan suburban neighbors to Boston, we're a town. We don't have a mayor. You referenced gathering the mayors on one occasion. And then lastly, while we all completely understand that school impacts are not legally part of the discussion around housing under fair housing law, the sad reality is that politically they're very much part of the town meeting debate because of the incredible growth in our schools of late, in the town's inability here today to to source a ninth elementary school. So in that sort of context, please talk a little bit more about how that could work here in town.
It's very simple. Thank you. Well, first of all, let's go back to the demography, which is really important here. A lot of the units we're talking about here, I would think, if we had a village, are actually going to be housing people who've lived here for 40 or 50 years. We're not talking about huge numbers of people moving from other parts of the community to come into Brookline, but as people age, as I have, we've got a big single-family home that I'm going to put up for sale fairly soon. I'm looking for housing where I can stay in the community where I've always lived, but in housing that's more appropriate for me. So the first thing is we need an educational campaign that begins to help our citizens recognize that we're not having these hordes of people coming in. We're to a great extent, finding housing for themselves as they age and sometimes for their children. The second thing is that you need to look very carefully at areas where you could do larger, denser housing which doesn't interfere. But in a lot of one of the other ways we could solve this is not the village idea, but making it easier for people to have accessory apartment units within their single-family homes. Some communities are starting to move to allow that more easily. And that works and potentially could work for someone like myself by having maybe a young person or a young couple also share my house with a second kitchen, let's say, and that would mean that I could stay in my home and yet provide housing for somebody, and also it would help me. So I think we have to think about a range of housing that will do that. Obviously, I was one of the people who testified in favor of the governor's bill. In fact, there was no one who really testified against it, including the Mass Municipal Association, which has testified against a lot of housing legislation. Being able to find ways of giving communities some added benefits, some carrots for, let's say, adopting majority plus one for zoning changes makes a lot of sense. I happen, along with Eleanor White and Ted Carmen, were the creators of 40R. We wrote the 40R legislation, which was to reward communities, unlike Chapter 40B, which is a stick, with if you create a 40R district as an overlay district over your current zoning, the state will give you an extra dose of local aid up to $600,000 just for creating the district under 40R. And then for every unit that gets permitted, another $3,000 goes into the local coffers that can be used for a lot of good stuff. When we first got that passed in 2005, and we even got Governor Romney at the time to sign it, only one community came forward. And I went out and I talked with a lot of communities and said, well, the reason we don't want it and why we won't do a 40R in our community is it might work. I said, well, what do you mean it might work? Well, we do it, and then the developer comes in and builds all this housing, and then families move in, and then their kids flock to our schools. So we came back. I'm an economist. I said, what happens if you fear something bad happening? You take out insurance, auto insurance. So we created 40S, which is the school insurance bill, which exists, and it says, essentially, if your school costs go up by more than X percent, the state picks up 100% of all the additional school costs. So there are ways to deal with the school cost issue as well. I think the other thing we need to do is think about, what do these buildings actually look like? We don't want them to be monstrosities. That's why we've been working with some of the best architects, Peter Rose and Tamara Roy and others, who are coming up with those drawings I showed in my, that would be a very attractive kind of housing stock to have and would add to the beauty rather than detract beauty of the community. So I think there are answers to that. In terms of costs, a lot of it has to do with reducing the cost of construction. There has been no increase in the productivity, that is output per person hour, the efficiency of producing single-family homes in 70 years. In 70 years. If you go see it, it's still the same. Once in a while you see somebody with a nail gun, otherwise they're still with a hammer and nails. Meanwhile, productivity in the economy as a whole, the U.S. economy has gone up 300%, and in manufacturing by 800%. So one of the great things about these ideas is bringing together these developers and construction companies, as I said, like Suffolk and Gilbane that we're working with, to think about new ways of building at least parts of housing that would lower the cost dramatically. So, yes, lots of problems, but I think the kind of gang of people that I've been working with who got excited about this are trying to solve each one of them either politically, economically, or technically.
Thank you.
Very happy to hear you speaking positively, Barry, about accessory dwelling units in homes. While it's not the theme of tonight's program, the Housing Advisory Board sponsored a number of years ago accessory dwelling units. It didn't quite make the two-thirds at town meeting, but we've been encouraged to have another look at it, and we're just putting that back on our agenda to see if it'll fly next year, maybe this year. My question is first for you, Barry, and then for other panelists as they choose to chime in. As was mentioned, Mayor Walsh has set a housing unit production goal for the city of Boston of 53,000 units, and they're well along their way, building like the Dickens. While more recently, the governor has set a statewide goal of 153,000 units. So there's a difference, which is the rest of Massachusetts, and as you mentioned, most of that is around Boston. So my question is, what method will be used, and by whom, to arrive at housing production goals for individual cities and towns that are surrounding Boston? And will any state or regional entity be likely to be seeking to quantify or assign a quote-unquote fair share of future housing production to communities such as Brookline? And if that answer might be yes, then what key factors would you think might go into defining such a fair share for Brookline and other communities?
Well, it's my understanding that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the official regional planning agency for 101 towns and cities, including Brookline, is going to be working on putting together those goals, working with Jay Ash, the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, and the successor to Crystal Gornegay, who just left as head of DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development. So they already have all the demographic projections for each community. They're going to be looking, I would hope, at maps like this to see which communities have the area, the locations that would make sense. As I said, I've been working, I was last year working with the town of Malden as they're completely redoing their downtown area. They're going to be tearing down their city hall and trying to rebuild it with young people, and that's why they like this idea of the village. So there will be some communities that I think will be able to take on more of the housing burden, given their area in square miles and given how much land they have that's available for it. And I think, MAPC, working with all of the individual towns and cities, will come up with those targets. And then I think it will be up to the city to either say, yeah, that target is a fair target, or tell MAPC, we think you did not take certain factors into account. But I think once you have that target, you can then have a meaningful civil discourse over whether that's appropriate for our town and city, and that begins to get the ball rolling.
So you mentioned about the governor's Housing Choice Initiative being a carrot and Chapter 40B being a stick. Mm-hmm. When push comes to shove on assigning the fair share from the Commonwealth to the communities, do you see that as being more likely to be a carrot or a stick or a combination?
Well, the governor has made it very clear he wants it to be a carrot. And so there's going to be a lot of technical assistance. There'll be more financial aid. One of the things that he's linked in with it is going to the head of the line for infrastructure grants from the state, so that this could be financially rewarding. And when we wrote 40R in 2004, 2005, this is 14 years ago, we said, what we should be doing with with much of the local aid is making more of it conditional on best practice, because if we can do things in Brookline or Newton, where I used to live, or Cambridge, or right here in Brookline, where my father lived at 100 Center Street for the last 8 years of his life in Hebrew Senior Life, if we're willing to step up and help solve a statewide problem, affordable housing, transportation, let's reward the communities that take that initiative. So I've always been in favor of boosting the carrots. The sticks, you probably need some of those. But I would hope that, and I know the governor, I've talked with him about it, will be increasing the carrots so that we reward those communities that do the right thing for the betterment of the entire Commonwealth.
Barry,
Other comment?
yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about 40R as a carrot. You know, as a finance person, I've looked at the incentives there, and in the context of the overall development pro forma for inexpensive, already fairly built-out community, it's really de minimis. And there hasn't been, therefore, any serious developer that I'm aware of that's really looked at 40R here. So I was not surprised when I read in your housing report card that 40R has really only been relevant to those communities further away from the metropolitan area. In fact, there's been very little 40R in the inner core.
Exactly.
So if that's an example of a carrot, I just don't understand how a community like Brookline can, carry its fair share of incremental housing that clearly the Commonwealth needs.
Well, that's why I say we need to boost the carrots. We have to make the carrots more valuable. I think linking infrastructure funds from the state for roads, for water, for sewer is one way of doing that. I think linking it to school aid is another way, particularly for communities where they see a growth in the school-age population. Overall, we're going to have a decline in the school-age population over the next 15 years. But it's likely that it's going to grow in places like Newton and Brookline because, frankly, you have great schools. This is where people want to be. So there are ways of adding to the carrots that would not break the state budget, but would make it much more valuable for a community like Brookline or Newton or Wellesley to take advantage of things like 40R and the housing choice initiative of the governor.
Thanks. I have a two-part question. The Housing Production Report identified corridors. The question is talking about the tools. One's obviously modifying zoning. The question is, are there other tools besides modifying zoning to encourage folks to build in those corridors? And two, obviously part of modifying zoning is you are increasing land values once you start modifying zoning. Are there ways for the town to share in those increased land values, generating those towards affordable housing?
No. Good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. But I would suggest that we have a lot of barriers that we have to break down. And one is the cost of land. The other is the cost of construction. So beyond zoning itself, we have to find a way of doing that. What I'm hopeful of is that this task force that I've called for will not just be looking at one thing like zoning, which we often do. We just look at zoning or we look at the cost of land, but look at all of the barriers and put them together. I think when you think about the demography, you begin to realize that some of the issues that you'd really worry about, like increased automobile traffic or increased number of school kids, tend to be less important when we think about 20 to 34-year-olds, most of whom are not coupling up until later in that age period and having kids, and the fact that most of my graduate students and most of my older friends, we're using Uber and Lyft now. We're not driving our own cars around, and the young people are taking mass transit or on bikes. So things like parking, which I know is a serious problem in Brookline. You must have the toughest parking requirements. I used to go to my sister's house and have to leave by 2 o'clock in the morning or fear I'd get a ticket on Tappan Street. Those are things I think we can deal with by thinking about the demographics.
Barry, just to pick up on that, capturing of land values, do you have any particular thoughts or views about inclusionary zoning? We've made that work here really feasible, and we think it's because our land values have tended to be so high. If you have any thoughts to offer.
Inclusionary zoning, has been used in cities like Brookline, in towns like Brookline, in cities like Boston, And it has allowed us to build affordable housing for people with, let's say, no more than 80% of the average median income in the community. And we continue to need to do that. What I'm talking about is the housing stock which we're not building, which is so difficult to build. I mean, developers know how to build millennial towers. That's easy, because people have enough money to spend God knows how much money on condos. And very good developers who've been able to take advantage of low-income housing tax credits, which we hope the Trump administration will not destroy, although they might, and other forms of tax credits have figured out how to produce some housing for very low-income people, including inclusionary zoning funds that are put together to help that. Our big problem, the one I'm trying to solve, is everything in between, which is where most people are. Too wealthy, that's the wrong word, to qualify for subsidized housing, and way too poor to qualify for the housing that's going up. So I think, inclusionary zoning is one piece, but it's one that I have not been emphasizing, because I think we know how to kind of work that. I'm trying to figure out how to do that vast middle for working and middle-class families that we failed to do anything about.
That's, in Brookline, that's about $500,000 now of income between the market and the programs that serve even moderate income.
Yeah, and with that, you could probably build half a home. Sure. Except in Detroit.
Ann, do you have a question?
So I just want to focus on the senior demography, since it's growing so fast. And I did what you're apparently thinking of doing, which was sell the house I've been in for 40 years, and I wanted to stay in Brookline. And I ended up being very lucky in finding a place that met my criteria right in Coolidge Corner. But there isn't a whole lot that isn't very luxury housing like that. And so I'm wondering, particularly, I mean, I lived 3/4 of a mile from Coolidge Corner all those years, and now I'm right there. And it's wonderful, and I'm wondering if there are tools that are available to use to help with financing and zoning, so we could build housing like that in our commercial areas. We have a lot of one-story buildings in Coolidge Corner that people would love to live above, but we need a way, again, because it's so expensive to build and buy the land here. Are there some tools that can be used to do that?
Well, one, you probably have zoning that restricts building above those, maybe not.
Not in the commercial areas.
Okay, well then that's good.
What is it?
That's one barrier that you're over. I think, along Harvard Street, Coolidge Corner, there's great opportunities there. And you do have high-rises nearby. 100 Center Street, I think, is 12 stories, where my father lived. And I think there's good reason to think about keeping the commercial retail on the first floor and building above it. One of the things that's really neat working with these construction firms and working with some of the developers is thinking about new materials for building 5, 6, 7 stories. Usually if you go above 5 stories, you have to go to big reinforced steel. You don't have to do that anymore. You can use light steel. You can use new wood products that allow you to go up as high as 30 stories. I'm not suggesting we should. But I'm saying there are new ways of doing that lower the cost dramatically. The second thing is we're doing this survey of graduate students and interns and residents to try and get a better idea of what kind of units do they really want. How much room do they need? For example, I visited a graduate student village. This is where I first came up with the idea, at a university in Barcelona, Spain. And it was fascinating because many of these units were very small. They were probably no more than about 280 square feet for a single graduate student. It had a room for a bed and a study space and a bathroom. And each corridor with 6 units had a common kitchen and a refrigerator, which when you opened the door had 6 compartments in it. And it also had a common living room with a 62-inch screen. And I talked with some of the graduate students, and they loved this, and they preferred it much more than getting an apartment with 3 or 4 other students. They had their privacy. They had a quiet, it's also well-insulated, sound-insulated. But they also had they don't make dinner every night. And so having a combined kitchen, having a common kitchen made a lot of sense. Plus, they got to know some of their neighbors much better. I have been thinking, way before I came up with this idea, a bunch of my friends that I've had for a long time have been thinking about, wouldn't it be great, instead of doing what we did with my parents, which was basically to stick them in Hebrew Senior Life where they knew no one, to get something when we're still pretty vital that would be multi-unit with a lot of amenities, and then as we got older, bring in more and more amenities that we might need. Maybe a chef that would come in 2 nights a week, and maybe a social worker, or a masseuse, or somebody to give us, keep us young, working out, and doing yoga with us. And then ultimately, more stages of aid. But in that way, essentially aging gracefully with our best friends, rather than with strangers. And I think that's the kind of idea that would fit perfectly in Brookline. It would fit perfectly in Newton, where I used to live, and in places like Cambridge.
It's interesting because I have a group of friends, one of whom is sitting in this room, who's talked about that very idea for years. And as we thought about it, actually, we all used to live in Brookline. We don't anymore. Some of us still do. But we were thinking of buying an old Victorian house, which means getting elevators, but that's a problem. So figuring out how to finance something that was newer, you could have elevators or be on one floor or whatever, is a challenge in Brookline.
Well, a number of my friends, I'm a reasonably good cook. A number of my friends are really good. I would rather share a kitchen with 3 other or 4 other friends or older couples. And I would be happy to be sous chefs when they're preparing dinner for us. I'd love to work out with them and play, golf and tennis when we still can, and do bicycling, and then as we get older, do a little workouts together in the building. But that also means, and that's why we've been talking with great architects, is how do you build something that really works for people that are, let's say, 55 and above, and still works when you're 85, as opposed to moving into Hebrew Senior Life at 100 Center Street.
So we'll do 1 or 2 more questions from the panel, and then we've got some, I see, good questions from the audience that we'll take for the remaining time. Paul, did you have another question that you wanted to ask?
Sure. Barry, the town, as I'm sure you are aware, has been deluged by 40Bs. We have a safe harbor until March 23rd, and what's in the queue will push us over the 10% state housing inventory. Once that occurs, how can a community like Brookline continue to move forward? We have, a great amount of sort of social justice in our blood. Everybody wants more affordable housing in middle-income housing.
But not on my block.
Precisely. So how do we, as a community, promote mixed use in middle-income housing?
I think the biggest task we have in front of us, whether we reduce the voting from supermajority to majority or not, is really working with our community, getting back into our community, talking with our neighbors, talking about what this housing would really be like, how it would affect their own property values, and also suggesting how it will improve the tax base that might keep their property taxes down a bit. Because I think we've done a very bad job of communicating with our neighbors and our residents street by street about what housing little additional housing in their neighborhood would mean. Again, we're not talking about putting up millennial towers in Brookline. We're talking about modest-sized multifamily housing. I have it right at the end of my block, and I remember I went to a Cambridge housing committee meeting, and I was asked to speak there. And there were all these people at the back who, we were talking about upzoning Central Square and Kendall Square. And ultimately, the city did. But there were all kinds of people at the back of the room who were saying, we're opposed to any kind of upzoning. We don't want any more housing. And I remember turning to them and saying, I'm really glad that all you landlords turned out to oppose this, because obviously, and I am a landlord, I have tenants on my second and first floor. I said, you're going to make me super rich, right? If we can just keep the supply of housing down, you're going to make landlords rich. And of course, they were saying, we're not landlords, we hate landlords. I said, well, why are you doing their bidding? I think we have a big educational issue we have to address, a big educational function we have to take on. And that's really having more meetings like this with more communities, neighborhood by neighborhood, saying, let's think about what would be appropriate on your street or your set of streets that would fit in well with your community and yet begin to move us toward the kind of housing for you as you get older, for your kids, that works.
Thank you. Mike, Ann, anything
I
you
think
want to
my
add?
question got addressed.
Okay, Taylor, you all set?
Yeah, I'd like to see what.
Yeah, we've got some good stuff here.
Okay?
Thank you, audience. The first question from the audience. Decent handwriting, so I can read it. Brookline does not have much land for development, but schools are exploding with new students, and there are 3 or more Prop 2.5 overrides coming. So there's a problem of higher costs, and we do need more income from our commercial development. How do we reconcile these opposing forces? Good question. Anybody want to start on that one?
Well, part of the challenge tonight was to figure out how to make them not opposing and develop them together, and figure out how to do that. So I don't have an answer, but
Part of it is, as we said, mixed use, mixed income. I'm talking in our 21st century villages of having retail and adding more retail, and often fitting in well with the tenants in that building. So that helps solve the problem a little bit. The other thing is that if you have more residents and more housing, presumably you increase your revenue base without having to have a Prop 2.5 override.
Yeah, there is really a convergence of getting as much income-producing development as we can. It produces a higher tax rate.
Not tax rate, tax base.
Tax base, no, a higher tax
Base.
rate. No, there's another term, though. It's 170. The commercial development produces 175% rate of the residential. So we get it both ways, plus the hotel room tax and meals tax. So that's part of why I think we're trying to converge EDAB and HAB to come up with good development in places where the community will find it most acceptable.
it's also important just to note that if we have more residents in the commercial areas, there would be more activity on the streets in the commercial areas, which is one of the things people have been concerned about, and potentially fewer empty storefronts and things like that, because it would be easier to run a business in the commercial areas. So that's
We also don't have right now a great track record in terms of looking at mixed-use, mixed multifamily apartments in terms of the revenue generated to see whether in fact they are revenue negative or positive in terms of the community. So it may be a revenue plus when we actually see some of these 40Bs built. And some of them have in fact retail on the ground floor.
So here's one that relates to a very important subject that didn't get touched on, but it affects everything we do in affordable housing, fair housing. How, I guess initially directed to you, Barry, how would the village model affect income inequality? How does the village model square with laws requiring housing to be open to everyone? Would that be a barrier to selecting graduates and students and elders and designating them? Is there any conflict with that and fair housing concepts?
No. I mean, first of all, as I think I said, the village concept is specifically to have mixed income. And by building units, all of which are nice, but at different levels of amenity and different levels of finish. We've been talking with some of the developers, and we're talking about getting a single small unit down to rent at somewhere between $900 and $950 a month, as opposed to an average now of $2,700 and $1,900 for a single bedroom. So both by reducing the construction costs, using some bond financing, getting, where we can, in some communities, not Brookline, less expensive land that might be public land, we believe we can make the numbers pencil out, so that the smallest units would be in that price range. The more fancy units, and particularly we thought as you went higher, you'd make them fancier and bigger units, would probably be at market rents of $2,500 to $3,000. There might even be a little bit of cross-subsidization of the low-cost units by the upper-cost units and by the retail, so as to make those rents affordable for people of modest income.
Interestingly, I think the first micro-housing proposal in Brookline, and it was in one of these opportunity corridors on Harvard Street, came before us a few weeks ago. And for just a few hundred square feet, I think the market rent projected for those was something like $1,600.
Well, this is why we're working very hard to find every which way to reduce costs. We did a study, I think, 2 years ago in one of our housing report cards, and we were able to get something like 16 major developers to give us proprietary information on their costs. And it turned out in Boston, Greater Boston, the average cost by square foot for standard multifamily housing was pushing, this is all in, housing, land, soft costs and all that, was pushing about $300 a square foot. So you're talking about a 2,000 square foot unit would be $600,000 to just build. You can't make that work. So we have to think about ways of using new materials and new building techniques to improve productivity immensely to get down to that like $950 for the smallest unit I'm talking about.
Here's one that's short and sweet.
No, I did not advocate the killing of President Trump.
Is that in here somewhere?
Some people have been asking me that nationwide.
It was to
I just want him to disappear quietly.
fall asleep and not wake up or something.
Something like that. You said that, not me.
What happens when millennials have families?
What happens? They get a lot of
I assume
headaches.
this relates to the housing.
Right. Oh, the housing part. Yeah, no. I mean, they had, oh, yeah, that? That's, well, one of the things that I think happens is, maybe not immediately when they have their first young kids, but as we provide housing for aging people like me, we empty out some of the older, larger housing stock for that next generation of young millennials with children. And so I see them coming along and wanting, at least for part of their life, demographically appropriate housing, which is most of what we have here. So I think that's how we solve that problem.
Professor Bluestone, Brookline has high minimum parking requirements. Can you comment on the impact of this on the prices, types, and supply of new housing? Parentheses, both residential and commercial, but mainly residential.
Again, from what I was saying, the kind of 21st century village that I'm talking about, the demographics I'm talking about, I think presumably is going to have very little added impact on parking. Older citizens, young people who are not using their cars or owning cars. So I don't think, given the demographics, if I thought these were all going to be, lots of families moving in with 3 kids and 2 cars needing a garage, obviously that's not going to work in Brookline. But that's not the demographics we face, and it's not the demographics we're going to face between now and about at least 2040. So I think there'll be a minimal impact on housing and congestion, traffic congestion.
A transportation question relating to housing. Can you comment on whether you believe that better public transportation to and among the further flung communities, apropos of the curve you showed up there earlier, would open up housing opportunities there and take any meaningful pressure off the inner core communities such as Brookline?
Absolutely. And I've been working on a number of studies that I've begun at Northeastern, working with, for instance, Governor Dukakis and former Governor Bill Weld on the North-South rail link that would link North Station and South Station. We've been looking at new forms of transit, including working with the former Senate transportation head, now mayor of Lynn, Tommy McGee, about really moving toward more water-based transit, let's say between Lynn, South Boston waterfront, and Quincy. with high-speed ferries like we have between Boston and Provincetown. I mean, we can get from Boston to Provincetown, I do it all the time, in 90 minutes. Lynn Waterfront, which could probably sustain several hotels and several thousand units of housing, would become immediately accessible to Boston if we had year-round ferry service. And I guess only one good thing that comes out of climate change is the harbor never freezes anymore. So you can actually have year-round, or mostly year-round, water transit. So doing that allows us to open up much more areas. The other reason why I've been favoring like the North-South Rail Link is we actually have I'm a labor economist, we have two distinct labor markets in Greater Boston. Nobody knows about it. It's north of the city and it's south of the city. And in fact, one of my graduate students that he just did, using census data, where people live and where people work. And the number of people who live north of the city and work south of the city is minuscule, and vice versa. And what we're finding now, for instance, in the Amazon headquarters space, if you talk about putting them at Suffolk Downs, north of the city, their labor force, 50,000 possible jobs, they are trapped just north of the city in terms of the labor market. So what we need to do is, at the same time we're working on housing, we need to spend equal amounts of effort on producing transportation that both helps solve our housing problem, but also solves a serious labor market issue that is constraining our future prosperity.
Other panelists, if anybody wants to jump in on any of these, you're invited to, as I go to my next question. So,
Please help out.
I'd like to jump in on a question of Barry, as you're looking at the next question from the audience. Have you thought about the scale of a 21st century development? I'm not talking 5, 6, 7 stories. I'm talking about overall square feet or number of units that would achieve, sort of financial feasibility. There are many, many underdeveloped, but very small sites in fragmented ownership. So
I haven't given a lot of thought to that, but when I thought about it, I thought, well, the smallest of these 21st century villages might have no more than, let's say, 20 units. The largest could have 300. I mean, the kind of thing we could do at Malden Center would be large. There are other locations where we have a good-sized chunk of land, not a lot of single-family homes near it. The Lynn waterfront would be the Lynn has this large piece of waterfront which was undevelopable because NSTAR had huge power lines running right along the water. 4 years ago, they moved the power lines to the back of that very large acreage parcel, which makes that possible for literally large hotels that could serve the Boston Convention Center, but also large-scale housing. A few years ago, the Beal Company, Related Beal, had plans for large housing developments in Quincy Center. That failed for financial reasons, but they were able to show where that would fit in. So I see a mix of villages, some of them fairly modest, others being much larger. I haven't worked out, and none of our developers have worked out, the cost differential of building 20 units versus building 200 units. But I presume we'd have to think about that.
So can I follow up on Paul? I do financing of rental developments for my day job, and just given the cost of land and development in Brookline, it seems to me 20 units in Brookline would be a very, very difficult undertaking. So,
Yeah.
another subject we've been reading a little bit in the papers. There are currently over 300 Airbnb units known to exist in Brookline. Increasing Airbnb units which do not have owner occupants and are using apartments and condo units may eventually usurp existing apartments and decrease the rental housing stock. How do you propose, or how would you propose to deal with this? Is regulation the answer? And I think we know that Boston is moving ahead with some form of regulation. I'm sure you've probably given some thought to this.
I've given very little thought to this, but what I know the city has been thinking about is, first of all, making a distinction between, an individual homeowner who rents out part of their home or their apartment part of the year, as opposed to some of these new developments that are going in where the developer is actually setting aside so many units, even in a brand-new development for short-term rental. That's the market that has to be regulated. I think the other thing, too, is that we should be taxing it. We should put like a hotel tax on the Airbnb and use some of that revenue for a housing fund. And I think that's precisely what DND, the Department of Neighborhood Development, is thinking about for the mayor in Boston.
Anybody else comment on that one? With the scale necessary to produce the housing of the type we were talking about, how do we ensure that developers are not receiving windfalls for these projects, which are not being evaluated in the manner that 40Bs are? Anybody?
My answer to that is, as I said, the kind of villages I'm talking about that would be, which would have these master leases, would also have some rent guidelines that might extend over the same time of the master lease, so that you'd know in advance that the developer's making a fair return, but not an exorbitant one. And with those kinds of deed restrictions on individual units, you could keep this housing affordable or more affordable over time, where you might say, rents can't go up any more than the standard inflation rate per year.
One of the, Mike?
Well, it seems to me you're going to set a target mix of units in terms of low and moderate, and hopefully try to hit the affordability gap that we're missing in terms of that middle income, and have monitoring, but then you may not be concerned about profitability or limited dividends like you are on other typical affordability, and you're going to have design guidelines, but beyond that, you may not be concerned in terms of monitoring profit.
And actually, that's, going back to inclusionary zoning for a moment, we are currently undertaking a comprehensive review of our inclusionary zoning to see if the sweet spot can be defined better to capture some of the excess value for the sake of affordable housing in the properties. Well, let me see if I can, Paul?
Yeah, one way to look at the question of egregious developer profits is, in my opinion, for the kind of development that we're talking about to happen, we would need upzoning. Typically, to do upzoning, you need to make a case to town meeting that the envelope that is being created is of sufficient scale to induce risk-taking of capital in the private market. That's what we're talking about here. We want developers to put their capital at risk. So a way to control it on a free market basis is to make sure that the envelope that town meeting is passing is sufficient to create enough financial feasibility but not excessive profits.
And that means finding locations like above retail, which would give you enough scale to get there.
As well as enough public benefit in terms of affordability.
Right.
On top of that.
Ann?
No, I was handed some questions sort of about growth. These are related. One person is concerned that North Brookline is very congested. All the proposals are for putting up more and denser development in North Brookline, and that the neighborhood is feeling under attack. Another one is talking about not on my block is not the case, and reasonable growth can be accommodated, but how can we do that with all the 40Bs? And then bigger picture, farther out in the future, we know about intense housing needs and the needs to address them. In doing that, we're creating the city of tomorrow. But what's realistic? This person's concerned about dense high-rise housing defining the city and the neighborhood in the future, and can we keep our habitable community while meeting needs? Probably should have saved that one for the last question. But
The problem we have here is that, particularly when you have these 40Bs coming down your neck, is you have this impression that, you're going to have this gargantuan amount of new housing coming in. We're not talking about a gargantuan amount of new housing coming You know, if every community were to step up and produce its fair share, no community is going to have to take on so much housing that will really affect the nature of the community. We're not talking about building 50,000 units of housing in Brookline. We're probably talking about creating, in a master plan, several hundred more units of housing over the next 10 years. That can be accommodated by Brookline, and you've already shown some places where that could be done. But we need to have every community feel that it can do its part, and the problem we have now is Boston is taking on so much of this burden, and the other communities have to step up so that no community has to take on such a burden that it changes the nature of their community.
So here's a good question, although a tough handwriting. What happens to mom and pop stores and their owners, who are usually tenants of their commercial landlords, when buildings are demolished to rebuild as mixed-use development? Thoughts about that one?
Well, it's obviously a speculative question. No one knows definitively what happens. We do studies of our commercial areas and the balance between mom and pop businesses and so-called nationals. And while there's a tremendous amount of turnover of
Can you hear, Paul?
Yeah, excuse me. While there's a tremendous amount of turnover of local retail, they're not losing ground. That sector of our retail component is not losing ground to nationals. The scale of development that I think we're talking about here is not particularly conducive to nationals coming in for some mega retail opportunity on the ground floor. My sense would be that this type of development would not adversely impact what we all cherish in our commercial areas, which are the mom and pop local retail owners.
It's also possible, I think, in other places, and I don't see why we couldn't do it here, can be a condition for some of the permitting that there be spaces for either the current tenants or tenants like them moving forward in such a development. And I know that in other places, developers agree to that.
We may have touched on this one a bit earlier, but this may add a bit to it. So, okay. If you envision changing single-story commercial buildings to mixed-use multi-story, where will the residents park? Is it time to change Brookline's outdated ban on overnight parking to allow 24/7 parking for residents of these mixed-use buildings? That's been the subject of a lot of discussion in Brookline.
Yeah, I see no political appetite whatsoever to change the overnight parking. Parking is a huge constraint to redevelopment of these sites. In many of these sites, you just don't have the ability to ramp down to a garage in any kind of an efficient manner. So for a lot of these sites to be redeveloped, there would need to be considerably less parking than what we currently require.
I think there's also, again, the kind of demographic is not going to add a lot of automobiles. And there'll be changes over time for that. But you have major open parking lots off of Harvard Street, on both sides of Harvard Street. If this really became a major problem, I could see you building a low-rise, two-story parking garage like we have in Central Square in Cambridge, which would not really affect very much the residents around it, but would double the amount of parking if you needed it. But I'm not sure you need it.
Instead of that transportation question, instead of relying on existing transit lines, and we have heard in some of our recent public meetings, those of us that have been on the Coolidge Corner Study Committee, that the existing Green Line is so full for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours at night that it has no extra capacity. So this is real. Instead of relying on existing transit lines, why not require owners and developers of larger developments to to provide or pay for private bus service to existing transportation modes. Any thoughts on this?
We do some of that already. The Longwood Medical Area has free shuttle services to the Orange Line right on our campus. But what we've been talking with Stephanie Pollack's the Secretary of Transportation, and before she became Secretary of Transportation in the Baker-Polito administration, she was my Associate Director for 9 years. And one of the things we've been talking about is how do we speed up the use of buses and trolleys? And the answer is, number one, for the trolleys, we need better signaling equipment. We can't make the trolleys any longer because of the platforms. But one of the things that some communities have been doing with buses is doubling the number of buses, but then buses stop at every other bus stop. So you get the same number, because what slows down buses and slows down Green Line trolley is not that they travel slow. It's that they have to stop every few hundreds of feet and take time to have passengers get on and off. So what some communities, I think Seattle's doing this, is they stagger their buses, they add more buses, but the buses only stop at every other stop, which halves the amount of waiting time and speeds up and adds much more capacity and greater speed to your bus system. In another report that I will release with the Barr Foundation later this year, we're going to talk about how we pay for that. And it turns out, if you think about this, this is really neat. I have a plan for adding $2 billion a year to the Greater Boston MBTA system, commuter rail, subway, and stuff, that will not cost anybody anything.
Do you want to elaborate on it?
It turns out, if you go in my car I just traded in, it had a wonderful computer in it, which whatever route I took, it would give me, if I reset it, my average speed and my miles per gallon. And I started keeping track of my miles per gallon or my fuel efficiency, particularly when I was on the Southeast Expressway doing 10.4 miles an hour, going to a speaking engagement. And I was getting about 9 miles to the gallon. At 30 miles an hour, I was getting something like 27 miles to the gallon. This is a non-hybrid 4-cylinder automatic transmission car. So I started thinking about what would happen if we could reduce congestion on our arterial highways so as to double the average speed, which is now 18.4 miles per hour in the morning and afternoon commute, to 37.2 miles per hour, which is still almost 20 miles an hour below speed limit. And it turns out that this would save the average driver at only a gallon of gas at $2.30, it's now $2.60 a gallon, would save the average driver $300 a year in gasoline. And that counts their saved time, which is saving half their time in commute, at zero. So your additional time savings, I'm not even giving any cost to that. That would raise about $2 billion, and you'd save that amount of money in lower fuel costs. And then I said, well, how many cars would we have to get off the road? And I'm looking at all the arteries, 93, 93, and so forth. How many cars would we have to get off the road to double the speed? And because there's this whole fluid mechanics thing, it's the nth car that causes the congestion, you only have to get 13% of the cars off the road to double the speed on the artery. And surely we could find a way of improving bus transit, commuter rail with last mile transit so you can get to the commuter station and then get to your office, more parking lot areas like Alewife is filled by 7:30 in the morning, new signaling equipment, nicer cars, all of that. We're pretty sure we could get 13% of the drivers off the road because it would be more efficient for them to go by mass transit at that point. And that would free up for the drivers the roads to save them a lot of money and save them a lot of time. That's the kind of new thinking we need to have around transportation in the same way we need to have new thinking about what does this new housing look like. We're beginning, I've been talking with some of the people in the Baker-Polito administration. I've been talking with Bob DeLeo, the Speaker of the House, and saying, we need to have a better understanding, again, with the community, with our neighbors, of why either raising gasoline taxes a little bit or instituting what I prefer, a vehicle miles travel tax, based on your odometer readings in your RMV inspections. And we could also make it politically palatable by prorating the VMT as you further get west in the state. It's lower, so that we get the western legislators supporting this. We could even make it more progressive by allowing low-income commuters who still drive to take a tax credit against their gasoline, against their VMT, to make the income tax more progressive. So there are ways of good public policy working on this housing plus transportation problem, which are linked, that would give us a better community and a more convenient community for everybody, whether you're taking transit or you're driving your car, whether you're living in a single-family home or in one of our new villages. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to figure out how do we get a win-win rather than a zero-sum game.
Here's a question about accessory dwelling units. If Brookline allows accessory units, how many living units would that potentially add? In one sense, it's anybody's guess, but one of the bills that was put forward in the legislature that was going to make accessory dwelling units by right had a cap of 5% of the single-family housing stock. If that cap were applied in Brookline, if say 1 out of 20 single-family houses were to create an accessory dwelling unit, that would be about 300 units scattered throughout the single-family areas of town. My guess is that that would be a very high figure to hope for in any near-term scenario. So it's not going to change the whole town, and what's being contemplated is not physical additions to houses, so it wouldn't change the physical appearance of the neighborhoods. It's what can be done within an existing home. Wondering about possibilities of connecting young folks with elders who live alone in some of these massive housing. Young people or middle-aged folks pay less rent, and elders would somehow would have someone to house with them. Understand that this has been started up in the United Kingdom.
Well, I think they're talking about accessory units there, if I'm not mistaken, or we're talking about in the villages, I'm talking about having mixed income, but also mixed age. I mean, I'm with my graduate students all the time. I wouldn't mind living in a building with them. Just no buildings right now where we could do that.
So I think we're just coming pretty close to 9 o'clock, and I'd like to ask one of these questions for the audience to see if anybody would like to comment on an issue that and a subject that Brookline is going to be facing. You heard a while earlier that we are very likely to meet our 10% goal for 40B and no longer have the state breathing down our neck for the stick portion of affordable housing development. That being the case, how and how much does the community want to encourage town leaders to support mixed income and mixed use development that includes affordable housing development and not rest on our laurels when we let out a deep breath and, hey, we reached the 10%? You're representatives of the community. Would anybody like to make a comment about that? Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, that's one way to answer. Tommy.
Tommy Vitolo, my understanding is some of our affordable housing expires. And it's no longer affordable sometime in the future. So we'd be crazy to get above 10%, stop, and then fall back below 10%. Why wouldn't we keep pushing the ball forward in a measured, thoughtful way so that as we lose units, we have a better chance of remaining above 10%? Pragmatically, speaking nothing about the ethics of affordable housing and having a community that we share and we all believe in, just purely from a pragmatic point of view, it makes sense to keep pushing forward on housing.
It's a very good point. We have been looking at that all along quite closely, and by the numbers, you're absolutely correct. Probably for the intermediate term, we're not going to face that as much as in some, out years. But we do need an insurance policy to be over the 10%, and we certainly wouldn't want to fall below it. Other thoughts about this issue? Should the town be continuing to press all of our affordable housing programs? Yes. Ma'am.
In addition, I think that the conflict still exists, and we need to kind of reconcile the need for commercial tax revenue as well, along with accommodating for affordable housing.
Thank you. I think that's the way that the HAB is trying to see it. If we can channel it constructively, then we shouldn't pause just because we've met the state's expectations of us. Anybody else want to comment on that? No? Yes, sir, in the back. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Wise.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. Susie.
I agree. Yeah. I talk about the area that you're talking about because it's the only area of Brookline I actually know. I don't live here. That's where my father lived. But when I look at this map, I see there are a lot of areas outside of North Brookline. And the reason? Transportation? That's the problem.
Route 9 is the full length of it, and there are certain parts which are more attractive than others to developers, but it's certainly something that we think wants to be encouraged. Yes, ma'am, way in the back.
I fully agree with you, and I've been saying for a long time, although I didn't focus it on, is all the work that I've been doing has been looking at transportation and housing as one issue, and also thinking about new forms of transportation, including public-private partnerships, the use of Uber, Lyft, using bus systems like the LMA, the Longwood Medical Area Bus System operated by the partners. There are a lot of ways of doing this if we think more comprehensively and a much more kind of integrated way of solving this problem.
It's a very good point. Certainly in the public meetings that were held, and I know you participated in them, way up high on that list was access to the various things that people need, and proximity. That doesn't necessarily mean North Brookline, and there are, the yellow on these charts shows some greater dispersion and some in South Brookline, but it's somewhat the product of that process. But thank you very much. There was another hand raised, one more? Yes, sir.
Well, this is why I mention, using something like the Uber-Lyft model, which is, of course, small transportation from passenger cars to vans. There are some cities that are now experimenting with special Uber-Lyft transportation for seniors, called Uber Silver, which is subsidized by businesses. We should be thinking about that model. And of course, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I love cars, right? I own one, actually. I don't apologize for that. But, down the road, we will solve this technologically with autonomous vehicles, and we'll need many fewer of them and so forth. But in the meantime, before that happens, we have to think about new ways of using our transportation system. And we're finding that Uber and Lyft is certainly serving the needs of my graduate students. Almost none of my graduate students own a car. They see no need for it, they don't want the expense of it, and they can get to any place they want through a combination of Uber, Lyft, and the T.
And our most recent senior housing development actually has, for residents, a mandated 0 parking percent ratio. The only handful of parking are for service providers and some
No one
staff.
had a car at 100 Center Street.
Right. Yes, ma'am, last question? Yeah.
Yeah. You're talking to the converted here. I've been talking mainly about improving our public transit system. The $2 billion that I want to raise goes into the T. And we need to make that work better, but there's also the need for shorter, particularly for people who aren't mobile, who can't walk 4 blocks to pick up the T to go to somewhere else. We do need something where you have some kind of van service or car service that's inexpensive, that works for people.
Last question, right here.
There is a related issue with Uber and Lyft. There was recently an article in the New York Times and a letter about the article. The article was about the suicide of a taxi cab driver who could not make a living any longer in New York City. And the article specifically commented on the low wages and poor working conditions of Uber drivers.
So I basically use taxi cabs because I drove a cab in Detroit for a while. But what I have been advocating, and I've talked with a lot of the taxi drivers, is many of them are saddled with a massive debt because they bought a medallion for, let's say, $400,000, and that medallion is now worth about $30,000. And what I've been, in fact, I've been talking with Joe Kennedy about this. He's your congressman, I think, and he's a dear friend of mine. And we're talking about a broader question that the Democratic Party has not addressed, and that is, whenever change happens in the world that benefits most of us but harms a small group of people, we should be able to find a way to compensate the losers out of the gains from the winners. So one way to do that is we think about the Airbnb and putting a tax on that. Another is to put a tax on Uber and Lyft and use the revenue for the state to be able to purchase the medallions from cab drivers who have a single car. I'm not talking about somebody who owns 20 of them and has made it into a business. So that, it was not their error to buy the medallion. You can't say they could have foreseen Uber and Lyft coming down the road. None of us could. Why should they bear the cost of that? And so we have to find a way to do that in the same way that we have to find a way to compensate the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia. Natural gas, solar will take their job away. But they shouldn't then see their income fall to working at Walmart. We should compensate that. One way we do that is through the earned income tax credit. But I'm thinking of all kinds of ways of compensating. And also, of course, what you'd like to do. I come from a union family. I'd love to see Uber drivers and Lyft drivers organize to get better wages and fair working conditions. But at a minimum, we should be protecting the taxi drivers who, through no fault of their own, have been harmed badly.
So we've covered a wide range of subjects on public policy and mixed-use, mixed-income development. Thank you so much for coming. We invite you to stay tuned to this subject, watch the website, and come to the public meetings of the HAB and the EDAB. Thank you again.
Thank you. Great job, Les.
See you. Oh, wonderful. Nice to meet you. Take care.